Karen from our HOA actually had the nerve to demolish my historic barn while I was away at my daughter's wedding, then tried to charge me $15,000 for the cleanup costs. I still can't believe the audacity of this woman. But hold, onto your seats, because this story gets even crazier than you could imagine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra, special for you. Before I dive into all the wild details, let me give you guys a quick update since my last video. A lot of you have been asking about the outcome of that crazy swimming pool incident I talked about last month. Don't worry, that situation got resolved, and I might do a follow-up video soon. But trust me, this barn story takes things to a whole new level of HOA insanity. So this all happened about 8 months ago, but I had to wait to share it because of the ongoing legal situation. You know how these things go. Lawyers always telling you to keep quiet until everything's resolved. Well, now I can finally tell you the full story, and boy, is it a doozy. For those of you who are new to my channel, I'm all about exposing HOA craziness and helping people deal with entitled neighbors who think they own the whole neighborhood. But in all my years of dealing with HOAs and sharing these stories, I've never encountered anything quite like this. Quick background. I live in this semi-rural area that's been slowly getting developed over the past decade. My property includes this gorgeous 1920s barn that's been perfectly maintained and was actually one of the main reasons I bought the place. We're talking about a piece of local history here, not some rundown old building. When I first started having issues with this particular HOA Karen, let's call her Patricia, definitely not her real name, I thought it was just the usual power-tripping, board member stuff we've all dealt with. You know the type, nitpicking about grass length, complaining about paint colors, that sort of thing. But Patricia, she took things to a whole other level. I'm talking about daily violation notices, constant harassment, fake complaints, and eventually something so outrageous that it led to a full FBI investigation. Yeah, you heard that right. The FBI got involved in this HOA dispute. That's how crazy this story gets. Now, I know some of you might be thinking, come on, how bad could it really be? Trust me, I get it. I've heard all sorts of HOA horror stories over the years, and I used to think I'd seen it all. But what Patricia did makes those other stories look like minor disagreements over garden gnomes. We're talking about forged documents, fake engineering reports, identity theft, and a criminal enterprise that spread across 5 different states. And at the center of it all was my historic barn, which apparently stood in the way of Patricia's grand schemes. But here's what really gets me, the sheer boldness of what she tried to pull off. This wasn't just about demolishing my barn or trying to scam me out of some money. As we eventually discovered, this was part of a much larger operation that she'd been running for years. And if she hadn't gotten so greedy with my property, she might have gotten away with all of it. So grab your drinks, guys, because this is going to be one wild ride. I've got all the documentation, police reports, and even some security camera footage to back up every single detail of this story. And by the end of it, you'll understand why this case is now being used as a training example for FBI agents learning about HOA fraud. Let me take you back to where it all started, because the lead up to this whole situation is crucial to understanding just how calculated and manipulative Patricia really was. Trust me, what you're about to hear will make you think twice about who's really running your HOA. So let me paint you a picture of our neighborhood, because understanding the setting is crucial to seeing just how calculated Patricia's whole scheme was. Our community, Willow Creek Estates, sits on what used to be one of the oldest farming properties in the county. When they developed it about 15 years ago, they actually did something pretty cool. They preserved a lot of the historic structures and worked them into the neighborhood design. You've got these beautiful modern homes mixed with restored agricultural buildings, My neighbor down the street has an old grain silo that's been converted into this amazing home office. Another guy has a former smokehouse that he turned into a really cool entertainment space. And then there was my barn. Lid, this gorgeous piece of 1920s craftsmanship that I'd spent years restoring. Now, our HOA was originally set up by the developers with some pretty unique bylaws. They specifically included protections for these historic structures because they were such a big selling point for the community. I mean, where else can you find luxury homes with authentic century-old farm buildings? Our marketing materials literally featured my barn on the cover of the brochure. The HOA rules were actually pretty reasonable at first. Basic stuff like keeping your lawn maintained, not painting your house hot pink, that kind of thing. And there was this whole section about preserving the agricultural heritage of the neighborhood. They even had a special committee dedicated to helping homeowners maintain their historic structures. I got really involved in all that when I first moved in. You see, I'm a woodworker by hobby, and this barn was like a dream come true for me. The previous owner had kept it in decent shape, but I wanted to take it to the next level. I spent almost 2 years working with historical preservation experts to restore it properly. We're talking about using period-correct materials, matching the original paint colors we found under layers of old coatings, even tracking down authentic 1920s hardware for the doors. The renovation cost me over 50 grand, but man, it was worth every penny. The barn became this perfect blend of history and functionality. I had my woodworking shop set up in one section, and I stored my classic car collection in the other part. Before Patricia showed up, our HOA meetings were pretty chill. We'd meet quarterly in the community center, discuss any issues, plan neighborhood events, that sort of thing. The biggest drama we ever had was when someone wanted to install a satellite dish on their historic carriage house. And even that got resolved pretty quickly with a compromise. But here's where things started to shift, and this is important for understanding what happened later. About 2 years ago, we started getting a lot of interest from developers. The area around our neighborhood was booming, and suddenly our little historic community was sitting on some pretty valuable real estate. The HOA board started getting offers, big offers, to buy out certain properties and modernize the neighborhood. But our bylaws made it tough to change anything about the historic structures. You needed like a 90% vote from all homeowners to even consider removing one of them. And most of us loved the character these old buildings gave our community. That's when people like Patricia started showing up. Looking back now, it's so obvious what was happening. These weren't just random people moving into our neighborhood. They were scouts for development companies, looking for ways to get around our preservation rules. At first, we had no idea. Patricia seemed like just another California transplant with too much money and too many opinions. She'd moved in with her husband Robert into the big house across from mine and immediately started talking about how the neighborhood needed to be brought into the 21st century. But here's what makes me kick myself now. We actually helped her get a foothold in the community. When she volunteered for the HOA board, we were all relieved because nobody else wanted the job. Man, if we'd only known what that decision would lead to. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about the first time I actually met Patricia, because looking back, all the red flags were there from day one. And trust me, what happened next set the stage for everything that was about to unfold. My first real interaction with Patricia happened during our annual Heritage Day celebration. It's this cool event we do every spring where we open up our historic buildings to the community. Local history buffs come through, kids get to learn about farming heritage, and we all have this big barbecue afterward. It's actually one of the things that made our neighborhood really special. I was giving tours of my barn that day. I love showing people the original hand-hewn beams, explaining how the old pulley systems worked, that kind of thing. I had some of my woodworking projects on display, and my pride and joy, a fully restored 1957 Chevy Bel Air, was sitting right in the center of the barn. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Patricia and Robert showed up about halfway through my third tour group. Right away, something felt off. While everyone else was asking questions about the history and admiring the restoration work, Patricia was taking photos and making notes on her phone. Not like a tourist, more like someone documenting things for an inspection. "This whole setup can't possibly be up to code," she interrupted me mid-sentence while I was explaining the original window mechanisms. "And storing vehicles in a wooden structure? That's a massive fire hazard. Who approved all this?" Now I'm usually pretty patient with questions like this. So I explained that not only was everything up to code, but I'd worked with historical preservation experts and modern safety engineers to make sure the barn exceeded all current safety standards. I even had a state-of-the-art fire suppression system installed, though you couldn't see it because we'd hidden all the modern elements to maintain the historical appearance. But Patricia wasn't interested in my explanations. She just kept muttering about liability issues and outdated structures. Then she dropped the first real red flag. "You know," she said with this weird smile, "a developer could fit 3 luxury townhouses on this plot. Probably get at least $1 million each for them, given the location." I laughed it off at the time. I mean, who moves into a historical neighborhood and immediately starts talking about demolishing its historic buildings? But that interaction set the tone for everything that followed. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing Patricia everywhere. She'd be outside my property early in the morning, taking more photos. She'd follow delivery trucks that came to my workshop, writing down company names and times. At first, I thought she was just being an overzealous neighbor, but it was more than that. She was building a case. The violations started showing up in my mailbox about a week after Heritage Day. Every little thing became an issue. The height of my grass, which was perfectly within regulations, the color of my mailbox, which had been approved years ago, even the vintage tractor wheel I had as a garden decoration. But the barn was her main focus. Every couple of days, there'd be a new complaint. The weather vane was non-conforming to architectural standards. The historic sliding doors were a security risk. My workshop tools were creating excessive noise, even though I only worked during permitted hours. I tried to handle it diplomatically at first. I invited her to come tour the barn again, this time with all my documentation and permits. I offered to show her the safety systems and explain how everything had been modernized while preserving the historical elements. But she always had an excuse not to meet. Instead, she started rallying other neighbors. She'd corner people at their mailboxes or during their morning walks, telling them about all the dangerous conditions at my property. She even started a neighborhood Facebook group called Willow Creek Safety Concerns, which was basically just a platform for her to post about my barn. The really frustrating part was that most of our neighbors knew she was full of it. They'd been in my barn, seen the restoration work, enjoyed the Heritage Day events, but Patricia was relentless. Every HOA meeting became a platform for her to raise serious concerns about community safety. Looking back now, I can see she was laying the groundwork for something bigger. Every complaint, every photo, every Facebook post, it was all part of her plan. She was building this paper trail of problems that she'd later use to justify what she did to my property. But at the time, I just thought she was your typical HOA busybody with too much time on her hands. Man, I wish I'd paid more attention to those early warning signs, because what she did next, well, that's when things started getting really crazy. So about 3 months after Patricia moved in, things started getting seriously weird. And when I say weird, I mean the kind of stuff that makes you feel like you're living in some bizarre reality TV show. Let me tell you about the day I realized this wasn't just normal HOA drama anymore. I was in my workshop one afternoon working on a commissioned piece for a client, this beautiful handcrafted dining table, when I heard voices outside the barn. Now I'm used to people stopping to admire the building, but this was different. These people were wearing suits and carrying clipboards, and Patricia was leading them around my property like she owned the place. I walked out to see what was going on, and guys, you wouldn't believe the story she was spinning. She was telling these men, who turned out to be from some development company, that the barn was scheduled for demolition and that this would be prime real estate available very soon. The absolute audacity of this woman. When she saw me coming, she didn't even flinch. She just smiled that fake smile of hers and said, "Oh, we were just discussing the future development plans for this area. You'll be receiving official notice soon." Then she led her little tour group away before I could even respond. That night, I decided to do some digging. I reached out to Tom, my neighbor who was on the HOA board, to ask if he knew anything about development plans. That's when I discovered that Patricia had been busy behind the scenes. She'd somehow gotten herself appointed as the board's property development liaison, a position that hadn't even existed before she created it. But here's where it gets really interesting. Remember those violation notices she'd been sending me? Well, it turns out I wasn't the only one getting them. Every single homeowner with a historic structure on their property had been getting hit with similar complaints. She was systematically targeting all the historic properties in the neighborhood. I started comparing notes with other neighbors, and we noticed a pattern. First would come the violation notices, then the safety concerns. Then mysterious inspectors would show up, always when the homeowners weren't around. Some neighbors even reported finding business cards from development companies in their mailboxes, with handwritten notes saying things like, "We can help with your property issues." One day, I caught her taking photos of my classic cars through the barn windows. When I confronted her, she claimed she was documenting safety violations because she'd received complaints about fluid leaks. But get this, she was taking close-up photos of the cars themselves, including their license plates and VIN numbers visible through the windshields. At the time, I thought she was just being her usual nosy self, but later, well, those photos would come back to haunt her in a way she never expected. The real kicker came during our next HOA meeting. Patricia had put herself in charge of the agenda, and she spent almost an hour presenting what she called her neighborhood modernization initiative. It was basically a plan to systematically remove all the historic structures and replace them with new construction. She had professional-looking presentations, cost analyses, even artistic renderings of what the neighborhood would look like after her improvements. The whole thing was met with massive pushback from the community. People loved their historic properties. They were why most of us moved here in the first place. But Patricia just smiled through all the objections and said, "Change is inevitable. We can either embrace it or get left behind." After the meeting, a group of us stayed behind to discuss what we could do. We decided to start documenting everything. Every interaction with Patricia, every strange visitor, every unauthorized photo session. I even installed security cameras around my barn, which turned out to be one of the smartest decisions I've ever made. What none of us realized at the time was that Patricia's modernization initiative wasn't just some overzealous HOA member's pet project. It was part of a much larger scheme, one that would eventually involve forged documents, stolen identities, and millions of dollars in fraud. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. Let me tell you about the event that really kicked things into high gear, because this is where Patricia's true colors started showing through that perfectly maintained facade of hers. Remember when I mentioned those security cameras I installed? Well, about a month after that HOA meeting, they caught something that changed everything. It was around 11 p.m. on a Tuesday night. I remember because I was in my home office finishing up some work when I got the motion alert on my phone. The footage showed Patricia and her husband Robert sneaking around my barn with flashlights. But here's the crazy part. They weren't just looking around, they were taking measurements, making drawings, and Robert was doing something really suspicious with the foundation. I watched live as they spent almost an hour examining every inch of the building's exterior. Now, at this point, I had two choices. I could confront them right then and there, or I could wait and see what they were up to. I decided to play it smart and just keep recording. Looking back, that decision probably saved my entire case, because what happened next was absolutely wild. The very next morning, I got an official-looking letter in my mailbox. It was on what appeared to be county letterhead, claiming that an anonymous tip had led to a structural inspection of my barn and that serious foundation issues had been discovered. The letter demanded immediate professional engineering assessment and repairs within 30 days, or the structure would be condemned. I know what you're thinking. Same thing I thought. How convenient that this letter shows up right after their midnight inspection, right? But here's where Patricia's plans started showing some cracks. First of all, the county letterhead looked a bit off, and when I called the county offices to verify the letter, guess what? They had no record of any inspection or complaint. But Patricia didn't know I'd done this verification, so when she came power walking across the street that afternoon to check if I'd received any important notices, I decided to play along. You guys should have seen her performance. She was like a bad actor in a daytime soap opera. "Oh my goodness," she gasped, pretending to read the letter for the first time. "This is exactly what I've been worried about. Thank goodness someone reported it before the whole structure collapsed." She then launched into this clearly rehearsed speech about how she knew a very qualified engineering firm that could help. Her husband Robert's company, of course. What Patricia didn't realize was that I'd already had the barn's foundation professionally inspected just 3 months earlier as part of my regular maintenance routine. I had detailed reports, photographs, and certification documents showing everything was not just up to code, but exceeding modern safety standards. But I didn't tell her that. Instead, I asked her for more details about this mysterious inspection. That's when she really started digging herself deeper. She claimed she'd heard that multiple engineers had been out to look at the barn. She even went so far as to say she'd seen them herself during the day, not at 11 p.m. with flashlights. While she was spinning this tale, I noticed something interesting. She kept checking her phone and glancing across the street at her house. It seemed odd at the time, but later we'd discover she was recording our entire conversation. She was building what she thought would be evidence for later use. The next day, more letters started arriving. These ones were supposedly from different engineering firms, all mysteriously discovering the same foundation issues. Each letter conveniently recommended Robert's company for the repairs. But here's the really interesting part. When we later analyzed these letters during the investigation, they were all printed from the same printer. How did we know? Well, that printer had a tiny defect that left a distinctive mark on every page. Patricia's campaign was ramping up. She started telling neighbors that my barn was on the verge of collapse. She even went door to door with photos she claimed showed massive foundation cracks. Photos that we later proved were actually from a condemned building in another state. She was building this whole narrative about how she was just a concerned neighbor trying to prevent a tragedy. But what really gave her away was something so small, most people wouldn't have noticed it. In one of her many complaint emails to the HOA board, she accidentally attached the wrong file. Instead of photos of my barn's supposed issues, she attached what looked like part of a business plan. Before she managed to recall the email, several board members had already seen it. And let me tell you, What was in that document set off some serious alarm bells. That accidentally attached document. It was a partial business plan for something called Heritage Heights Development LLC. At first glance, it looked like any other real estate development proposal. But as our HOA board members started reading through it, they noticed something disturbing. The document included detailed financial projections for a luxury townhouse project, projected to be built exactly where my property and several other historic homes were located. But here's the really crazy part. The document was dated 3 months before Patricia and Robert even moved into our neighborhood. This wasn't just some random development idea they'd come up with after moving in. This was a calculated plan they'd been working on before they ever set foot in Willow Creek Estates. Tom, my neighbor on the HOA board, quietly sent me a copy of the document. The more I read, the more obvious it became that Patricia and Robert weren't just overzealous neighbors. They were professional property scammers. The business plan included strategies for acquiring problematic properties through regulatory pressure and leveraging HOA authority to facilitate property transfers. I took the document to my lawyer, Sarah, who'd helped me with the barn's historical documentation. She immediately recognized some red flags. The company letterhead matched a known shell corporation that had been involved in similar schemes in other states. But when she tried to look up Heritage Heights Development LLC, it led to a maze of fake addresses and non-existent offices. While we were investigating this, Patricia was ramping up her pressure campaign. She started hosting weekly community safety meetings in her living room. Of course, I wasn't invited, but neighbors who attended told me she'd put together elaborate PowerPoint presentations about the dangers of historic structures in residential areas. She even brought in a so-called expert, who we later discovered was just one of her friends pretending to be a safety consultant. But Patricia made a crucial mistake during these meetings. She got cocky and started sharing too many details about her plans. She talked about how the development would revolutionize our neighborhood, showing architectural drawings and even discussing specific pricing for the townhouses that would replace our homes. Remember, this was all while claiming she was just a concerned neighbor worried about safety. One of my neighbors, an elderly lady named Mrs. Chen, who lived in one of the other historic homes, started recording these meetings on her phone. Mrs. Chen might have looked like a sweet grandma who was just there for the free cookies, but she was sharp as a tack and knew something wasn't right. Those recordings would later become crucial evidence. During one meeting, Patricia got so confident that she started discussing timeline projections. She mentioned how certain properties would need to be cleared by specific dates to meet the construction schedule. She even had this color-coded map showing which homes would be demolished in each phase of the project. My barn was marked as Phase 1 priority removal, but the real bombshell came when Mrs. Chen's recordings captured Patricia talking about her connections with the demolition company. She bragged about how they could work fast and ask questions later, suggesting they could tear down structures before owners could legally intervene. She even joked about how some people might come home to find their problems solved for them. At this point, I knew I needed to take serious action. I started gathering every piece of documentation I could find. Permits, inspection reports, historical certificates, everything. I installed more security cameras, including some hidden ones that Patricia wouldn't notice. I even started backing up all my footage to a secure cloud storage, just in case. I also reached out to the Historical Preservation Society that had helped with my barn's restoration. They were alarmed by what was happening and started their own investigation into Patricia and Robert's background. What they found in their archives was fascinating. Apparently, this wasn't the first time someone had tried to pull this kind of scheme in a historic neighborhood. But none of us were prepared for what happened next. Just when we thought we had a handle on what Patricia was planning, she pulled a move so bold, so outrageous, that it left the entire neighborhood in shock. And it all started with a seemingly innocent announcement about my daughter's upcoming wedding. Let me tell you about how my daughter's wedding announcement became Patricia's perfect opportunity. My daughter Emily had just called to tell me she'd finally set a date for her Vermont wedding. I was thrilled. She'd been planning this for months, and the venue she wanted had finally opened up. The catch? It was happening in just 6 weeks, and I'd need to be there for 2 weeks to help with preparations. Now, I'm usually super careful about announcing when I'll be away from home, especially with everything going on with Patricia. But this was my daughter's wedding. I had to be there. I told a few close neighbors I trusted, including Tom and Mrs. Chen, and started making arrangements for someone to keep an eye on my property while I was gone. Word travels fast in small communities, though, and somehow Patricia found out about the wedding. Her reaction, it was like watching a cartoon villain who just discovered the hero's weakness. She literally couldn't contain her excitement. I mean, she tried to play it cool, but anyone watching could see she was practically buzzing with energy. The very next day, she called an emergency HOA meeting. The agenda? Urgent safety concerns, requiring immediate action. But here's the thing, she scheduled this meeting for exactly 3 days after I was supposed to leave for Vermont. Real subtle, right? I wasn't about to let her pull anything while I was gone, so I started putting extra precautions in place. First, I gave Tom power of attorney specifically for my property. Then I hired a security company to do regular drive-bys. I even set up new cameras with direct feeds to my phone so I could check on things anytime. But Patricia had clearly been planning for something like this. Remember those fake inspection letters? Well, suddenly they started arriving daily. Each, one more urgent than the last, all claiming my barn was an immediate danger that required emergency action. She even had her husband Robert, still pretending to be a qualified engineer, submit an official-looking report to the HOA board. The report was ridiculous. It claimed the barn was showing signs of imminent collapse. According to Robert, there were critical structural failures that could result in catastrophic damage to surrounding properties. He even included photoshopped pictures showing massive cracks in the foundation that definitely weren't there. I took these documents to my actual structural engineer, Mike, who'd done the real inspection just months before. He was furious. The technical language in Robert's report was nonsense. He'd basically strung together engineering terms randomly, hoping no one would look too closely. Mike wrote up a detailed rebuttal, complete with current photos and actual structural analysis. But Patricia had one more trick up her sleeve. A week before I was set to leave, she started telling neighbors she'd received an anonymous tip that I was planning to convert my barn into a commercial event venue while I was away. She claimed I had contractors scheduled to start work without HOA approval. This was classic Patricia misdirection. While everyone was distracted by these false claims about renovation work, she was putting her real plan into motion. We later found out she'd already contracted with a demolition company, the same one her brother-in-law owned, and was just waiting for the right moment. I thought I was being paranoid, but I even went so far as to install motion-activated sprinklers around the barn. You know, the kind that can soak someone if they get too close. Mrs. Chen thought this was hilarious and started keeping watch with her binoculars, hoping to catch Patricia getting drenched. But Patricia was too smart to get caught in something that obvious. The day before I left for Vermont, I did one final walkthrough of my property with Tom and Mrs. Chen. We documented everything, took videos, photos, even had a notary come out to witness the condition of the barn. I gave them copies of all my documentation, including the real engineering reports and historical certificates. What I didn't know then was that Patricia had already set her plan in motion weeks earlier. While I was focused on protecting my barn, From direct attack, she'd been working on something much more insidious. She'd found a legal loophole, or at least what she thought was a loophole, that would let her bypass all our precautions. I left for Vermont feeling nervous but thinking I'd covered all my bases. The security company was on alert, my cameras were working, and my neighbors were watching. But Patricia had anticipated all of this. What happened next would show just how far she was willing to go to get what she wanted. The first week of the wedding preparations in Vermont was going great. Emily was so happy, and for a few days I actually managed to stop worrying about Patricia and the barn. I checked my security cameras regularly, and everything seemed fine. Tom and Mrs. Chen sent me daily updates, usually just texts saying, "All quiet," or "No Patricia sightings today." But then, exactly 8 days into my trip, things started getting weird. It began with a series of urgent emails from the HOA board. Apparently, Patricia had called an emergency meeting claiming she had new evidence about my property. She presented what she said were official county documents showing that my barn was actually built on land that didn't belong to me. According to Patricia's documents, there had been some sort of surveying error when the neighborhood was developed. She claimed that the barn actually sat on a piece of land that was designated as common area property managed by the HOA. Of course, this was complete nonsense. I had all my property surveys and deed documentation showing otherwise. Tom was texting me updates from the meeting in real time. "She's got this whole presentation," he wrote. "Maps, historical documents, even some kind of official-looking letter from the county assessor's office." But Tom, being the smart guy he is, noticed something off about these documents. The county seal looked wrong, and the signatures didn't match other official documents he had. Meanwhile, Mrs. Chen had positioned herself on her front porch with her binoculars and a camera. She noticed unusual cars driving by my property, taking photos. When she confronted one of the drivers, they claimed to be from something called Heritage Property Assessment Services, another one of Patricia's fake companies, as we'd later discover. That's when the really crazy stuff started happening. Patricia began posting on the neighborhood Facebook group about an urgent community meeting to discuss the illegal structure on my property. She was claiming that because the barn was supposedly on common land, all her previous safety concerns were even more critical because it made the HOA liable for any issues. I immediately called my lawyer, Sarah, and started forwarding her all the documentation. She was concerned, not because Patricia's claims had any merit, but because of how elaborate the forgeries were. "These aren't amateur fakes," she told me. "Someone spent serious money creating these documents." Then late one night, my phone started blowing up with security alerts. The cameras caught Patricia and Robert walking around my property again, but this time they had several other people with them. They were all wearing official-looking safety vests and carrying clipboards, pointing at various parts of the barn and taking measurements. Mrs. Chen, bless her heart, was on it immediately. She walked over with her phone recording and asked what they were doing. Patricia tried to play it off, claiming they were conducting an official HOA safety inspection. But when Mrs. Chen asked to see their credentials, they all quickly left. The next morning, I woke up to dozens of messages. Patricia had called yet another emergency HOA meeting, this one scheduled for that afternoon. But here's the really suspicious part. She was requiring in-person attendance for voting, knowing full well I couldn't be there. Tom tried to argue that this violated our HOA bylaws, which allowed for remote participation. But Patricia had apparently found some obscure clause about emergency safety measures, requiring physical presence for votes. She was literally making up rules as she went along. I spent that entire day on the phone, with my lawyer, with Tom, with other neighbors. We were trying to figure out how to stop whatever Patricia was planning. Sarah suggested filing an emergency injunction, but she was worried we wouldn't get it processed in time. That's when Mrs. Chen made a crucial discovery. She'd been going through old photos of neighborhood events, and she found something interesting. In a picture from last year's 4th of July picnic, she spotted Patricia in the background. Remember, this was months before Patricia supposedly moved to our neighborhood. When Mrs. Chen zoomed in on the photo, she could clearly see Patricia talking to someone we all recognized. The developer who'd been trying to buy up historic properties in our area. This was the first real evidence we had that Patricia's whole move to our neighborhood was pre-planned. But before we could really do anything with this information, my security cameras picked up something that made my blood run cold. A large demolition crew had just pulled up outside my property, and Patricia was there with what looked like official documents in her hand. Watching through my security cameras from 2 states away was like some kind of nightmare. I could see everything happening in real time, but I felt completely helpless to stop it. Tom was already on his way over with the power of attorney documents, and Mrs. Chen was out there trying to stall them, but Patricia had clearly planned this perfectly. The demolition crew looked confused when Mrs. Chen started waving her arms and telling them to stop. I could see Patricia showing them some kind of official-looking paperwork. Through the camera's audio, I could hear her saying, "We have all the necessary permits and authorizations. This structure has been declared an immediate hazard by the county." Tom arrived just as they were setting up their equipment. He was waving my power of attorney documents, trying to get someone to look at them. But Patricia had an answer for everything. She pulled out what she claimed was a court order. Apparently, she'd somehow convinced a judge that the barn was an immediate danger to public safety. My phone was blowing up with messages. My lawyer was frantically trying to get an emergency injunction. Other neighbors were calling the police, but Patricia had thought of everything. She had copies of her forged documents ready for the police when they arrived. The responding officers, seeing what looked like official court orders and county permits, said it was a civil matter and they couldn't intervene. The most infuriating part? I could see my classic cars still inside the barn. When Tom pointed this out, Patricia smiled and said they'd be safely relocated to a storage facility. But she wouldn't give any details about where this facility was supposed to be. Mrs. Chen was recording everything on her phone, and thank God she was. Because what happened next was so brazen, it would have been hard to believe without video evidence. Patricia actually started directing the demolition crew herself, telling them which parts to take down first. She seemed almost giddy with excitement. Was on the phone with my lawyer, watching this unfold on my security feed when the first wall came down. The sound of splintering wood and crashing beams came through loud and clear on my phone. 100 years of history just being ripped apart. My workshop, my cars, everything I'd worked so hard to preserve, all being destroyed while I watched helplessly from Vermont. But here's where Patricia's perfect plan started showing some cracks. In her excitement to get the demolition started, she made a crucial mistake. When the police asked to see the court order again, she handed them the wrong document. Instead of the fake court order, she accidentally gave them part of her development proposal, the one that detailed how they planned to build luxury townhouses on my property. The officers, now realizing something wasn't right, tried to halt the demolition, but Patricia started screaming about immediate danger and public safety, and in the confusion, the demolition crew kept working. By the time everything got sorted out, by the time my lawyer finally got through to a judge who could verify that no such court order existed, it was too late. My beautiful historic barn, the centerpiece of my property, and my pride and joy, was reduced to a pile of rubble. My cars were gone, supposedly taken to that mysterious storage facility. My workshop equipment, my tools, family heirlooms I'd been storing in there, all either destroyed or relocated. The police finally stepped in and stopped the demolition. Crew, but the damage was done. Patricia stood there with this smug look on her face, already pulling out more documents. These ones, she claimed, showed that because the barn was on common property, I was responsible for all demolition and cleanup costs. Tom and Mrs. Chen were amazing through all of this. They gathered evidence, took photos and videos, collected witness statements from other neighbors. Mrs. Chen even managed to get the business card of the demolition crew's supervisor, which would later prove crucial in tracking down my relocated cars. But the real bombshell came when one of the demolition workers, feeling guilty about what had happened, pulled Tom aside. He showed Tom something on his phone, text messages from the week before, showing that Patricia had planned this whole thing down to the minute. She knew exactly when I'd be away, exactly how long the demolition would take, and exactly how to create enough confusion to get it done before anyone could stop her. I had to make one of the hardest decisions of my life, whether to stay for my daughter's wedding or rush back home to deal with this disaster. Emily, being the amazing daughter she is, immediately said she'd postpone the wedding, but I couldn't let Patricia ruin that too. After a long discussion with my lawyer, Sarah, we decided that staying might actually be better strategically. It would give her time to gather evidence and file the right legal paperwork while I was away from Patricia's interference. But those next few days were absolute torture. I tried to stay present for Emily's wedding preparations, but I kept compulsively checking my security cameras, watching as Patricia orchestrated her clean-up operation. She had crews working practically around the clock, trying to clear away all evidence of what she'd done before I got back. The real hero during this time was Mrs. Chen. That woman missed her afternoon naps for a week straight to document everything. She catalogued every truck that came and went, took photos of every worker, and even managed to follow one of the trucks that she suspected was carrying my classic cars. That hunch led us to a storage facility 3 towns over, registered under one of Patricia's fake company names. Meanwhile, Tom was doing some incredible detective work of his own. Remember that demolition worker who showed him the text messages? Well, Tom convinced him to make copies of everything. The text showed Patricia had been planning this for months. She'd even timed the demolition specifically for when she knew local government offices would be closed for a holiday weekend, making it harder for anyone to verify her forged documents. But the most shocking discovery came from Sarah's investigation into the court order Patricia had used. Turns out she hadn't just forged a random document. She'd actually taken a real court order from another case in another county and meticulously altered it. The original was about demolishing an actually condemned property across the state. She'd changed the addresses, dates, and property details, but kept all the official stamps and signatures. This wasn't amateur hour forgery. This was sophisticated fraud that showed she'd done this before. Sarah started digging into similar cases in other states, and guess what she found? 3 other historic properties had been demolished under suspiciously similar circumstances, all in neighborhoods where Patricia had lived under different names. While all this was happening, Patricia was busy spinning her narrative to the neighborhood. She called another HOA meeting, again while I was away, where she presented a whole slideshow about how she'd saved the community from a dangerous structure. She even had the nerve to propose a special assessment to cover the emergency demolition costs. But here's where her perfect plan started falling apart. Remember that wrong document she accidentally showed the police? Well, it didn't just include her development plans. It had contact information for her investors. Sarah managed to track down one of them, and this guy was furious when he found out what was really going on. Turns out, Patricia had sold these investors on a completely different story. She'd told them she was a legitimate property developer who'd already secured all the necessary permits and homeowner agreements for a new luxury development. They had no idea she was actually demolishing properties without permission and forging documents. One of the investors, A retired real estate lawyer was so angry about being deceived that he turned over everything he had on Patricia and her schemes. This included emails where she bragged about how easy it was to manipulate HOA regulations and forge official documents. She'd literally created a playbook for taking over neighborhoods and forcing out homeowners who wouldn't sell. The day before I was supposed to return home, Patricia made her boldest move yet. She had her lawyer send me a bill for $15,000, the supposed cost of the emergency demolition and cleanup. The letter threatened to put a lien on my property if I didn't pay within 30 days. She really thought she'd back me into a corner where I'd have to either pay up or sell the property to her development company. But Patricia had no idea what was waiting for her when I got back. Between Mrs. Chen's documentation, Tom's evidence, from the demolition worker, Sarah's legal investigation, and the angry investors, we had built an airtight case against her, all while she thought I was just a helpless homeowner stuck at a wedding in Vermont. The drive home from Vermont was the longest 6 hours of my life. I'd managed to keep it together for Emily's wedding, which was beautiful, by the way, but now my mind was racing with everything I needed to do. Sarah had advised me not to tell Patricia I was coming back early, so we had the element of surprise on our side. When I pulled into my driveway, the first thing that hit me was the emptiness. Where my barn had stood for over a century, there was nothing but bare concrete and some scattered debris. Patricia had her cleanup crews working overtime to erase any evidence of what they'd done, but they couldn't hide the obvious. My historic barn was gone. I hadn't been out of my car for more than 2 minutes when I saw Patricia power walking across the street, wearing that fake concerned neighbor expression she'd perfected. In her hand was a stack of papers, probably more fake documents, and that ridiculous cleanup bill. "Oh, you're back early," she said, trying to sound surprised, but not quite hiding her annoyance. "I was just coming over to make sure you got all the paperwork about the emergency removal of that hazardous structure. We really need to discuss the cleanup costs." I cut her off mid-sentence. "Actually, Patricia, or should I say Margaret Delacroix, or maybe you prefer Elizabeth Conway. That was your name in Tennessee when you pulled this same scam, right?" The look on her face was priceless. For just a split second, her mask slipped, and I saw real fear in her eyes. But she recovered quickly, straightening her shoulders and putting on that condescending smile of hers. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice slightly less steady than before. "I'm just trying to help maintain our community standards and ensure everyone's safety. Now, about these cleanup costs," that's when I played my first card. I pulled out my phone and showed her the security footage of her midnight inspection with Robert. "You mean the cleanup costs for a demolition you planned weeks in advance? The one you scheduled specifically when you knew I'd be away at my daughter's wedding?" She tried to wave it off. "That was a legitimate safety inspection that confirmed what we already suspected. The structure was dangerous and needed immediate removal. I have all the necessary documentation right here." "You mean these documents?" I pulled out copies of her forged court order and county permits. "The ones where you copied and pasted from a demolition order in Anderson County. You didn't even bother to change the judge's bar number, Patricia. That was sloppy." Her face went pale, but she wasn't done yet. She started backing away, already trying to spin a new story. "There seems to be some confusion. All actions were taken with full HOA authority, and..." That's when Mrs. Chen emerged from her house, phone in hand, still recording everything. Tom pulled up in his car, and out stepped one of the demolition workers, the one who'd shown him the text messages. Sarah, my lawyer, got out right behind them. Patricia's eyes darted between them, probably calculating her next move. She tried one last time. "This is a private property matter between the HOA and..." "Oh, you mean the HOA that never actually voted on this?" Tom interrupted, holding up the real meeting minutes. The one where you forged board member signatures and created fake emergency sessions that never happened? What happened next showed just how dangerous Patricia could be when cornered. Instead of backing down, she pulled out what she thought was her trump card. She whipped out her phone and started playing a recording. It was me, apparently agreeing that the barn was unsafe and needed to be removed, except it wasn't me at all. She'd hired someone to fake my voice, probably using one of those AI voice generators. But she'd made one crucial mistake in this recording, a mistake that would help us unravel her entire operation and expose something much bigger than any of us expected. In the fake recording, my AI-generated voice mentioned something specific about the barn's condition, a detail about rotting support beams in the northwest corner. Here's the thing, though. My barn didn't have a northwest corner. It was hexagonal, something Patricia would have known if she'd actually bothered to look at the real architectural plans instead of copying from another demolition order. Sarah caught it immediately. She'd worked with the Historical Preservation Society on the barn's restoration and knew every detail of its structure. The moment she heard that detail in the recording, she started smiling. That one mistake was about to blow Patricia's whole operation wide open. "Interesting recording," Sarah said, pulling out her tablet, "especially since it matches word for word with this demolition order from a property in Michigan." She turned the screen toward Patricia, showing a document about a completely different barn demolition from 3 years ago. "Right down to the northwest corner that your target property never had." Patricia's face went through about 5 different emotions in 2 seconds, but instead of backing down, she doubled down. "That's ridiculous. I have witnesses who'll confirm these safety issues. Robert conducted a thorough inspection." "You mean Robert Patricia, your husband?" Tom jumped in. "The same Robert Patricia, who's not actually a licensed engineer in any state. We checked with the licensing board. In fact, we checked with every state licensing board. Want to guess what we found?" Mrs. Chen, still recording everything, chimed in with her perfect timing. "Or maybe we should talk about the storage facility where you took his cars. The one registered to Heritage Heights Development, a company that doesn't legally exist." That's when Patricia made her big mistake. In her panic, she blurted out, "Those cars were legally seized as part of the property reclamation process under Section 8.3 of the Development Agreement." Everyone went quiet. There wasn't supposed to be any development agreement. Patricia realized her slip-up too late. She'd just admitted to having plans for my property that she shouldn't have known about. Sarah pounced on this. "What development agreement would that be, Patricia? The one you signed with Maxwell Development Group 3 months before you even moved here? The one where you promised to acquire multiple historic properties for their new luxury townhouse project?" Patricia's whole demeanor changed. The fake concerned neighbor act disappeared, replaced by something much colder and more calculated. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," she said, her voice completely different now. "This is bigger than your little barn. Do you know who you're up against?" "Actually, we do," I said, pulling out my phone again. "Thanks to your investor, friend Mr. Harrison. You remember him, right? The one you told that you had all the proper permits and homeowner agreements. He was very interested to learn about your actual methods. That was when Patricia tried to make a run for it, but she'd forgotten about the demolition worker standing by Tom's car. As she turned to flee, he called out, "Hey, Mrs. Patricia, don't forget about those text messages you sent me last week, the ones where you laid out the whole demolition plan and promised to handle any legal issues that came up." She froze mid-step. We could practically see the gears turning in her head as she realized how completely surrounded she was. But Patricia had one last card to play, and it was a doozy. "Fine," she said, turning back to face us. "You want to play hardball? Let's talk about what's really going on here. You think this is just about your precious barn, your little historic neighborhood. This is about progress, about development. Do you know how many millions of dollars you're standing in the way of? Then she pulled out her phone again, but this time she wasn't playing any fake recordings. She started calling people, executives, investors, even a local politician's office. She was trying to bring her whole network down on us at once. What she didn't realize was that we'd been expecting this. In fact, we'd been counting on it, because every call she made just added another thread to the web of evidence we were building. And the really interesting part? Some of those calls went straight to people who were already cooperating with the investigation. As Patricia frantically made her calls, we could see her confidence crumbling with each one. What she didn't know was that for the past week, while I was at the wedding, Sarah had been working with state investigators who were already looking into similar cases across 3 states. Every person Patricia tried to call for help was either already under investigation or cooperating with authorities to save themselves. Mr. Davidson, it's Patricia. We have a situation with that property I told you about. Her face fell as she listened to the response. What do you mean you can't help? We had an agreement. Another call. James, the setup we discussed at Willow Creek. Hello? Hello? They were all either not answering or hanging up on her. That's when Robert, her husband, came running across the street. Patricia, stop making calls. They're all being... He froze when he saw all of us standing there. The demolition worker who turned on them just waved and said, "Hey, Mr. Patricia, remember those payment receipts you asked me to backdate? I kept copies of the originals." Robert's face went white. He grabbed Patricia's arm and tried to pull her away, but she shrugged him off. She was in full panic mode now, but still trying to maintain control. "This is all perfectly legal. We had permits, we had authorization, we have the real story," Sarah interrupted, holding up a thick folder. "Want to know what's in here? Statements from 3 other neighborhoods where you pulled this exact same scam. Property records showing how you used shell companies to hide your involvement. Bank transfers linking you to fake engineering firms. Oh, and my personal favorite, emails between you and Maxwell Development discussing how to neutralize historic preservation restrictions." Mrs. Chen, still recording everything, added her own revelation. "And don't forget about the storage. Facility manager, very nice man, showed me all the paperwork for the estate sale you planned for those classic cars. Funny how you were selling them before you even took them." That's when we heard sirens in the distance. Patricia's eyes went wide with panic. "Robert, the files! Get the files!" She turned to run toward their house, but Tom was ready for this too. He pulled out his phone and played a video, security footage from their home office, showing Patricia and Robert frantically shredding documents just hours earlier. "Oh, those files," Tom asked innocently. "The ones you started shredding this morning. Interesting timing, almost like you knew this was coming." The sirens were getting closer. Patricia made one last desperate attempt to regain control. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. This goes all the way to the state level. We have connections in the zoning board, the county assessor's office." "Had connections," Sarah corrected her. Past tense. "You see, when Mr. Harrison turned over those development plans, he also provided a very interesting list of government officials who were helping facilitate your schemes. Most of them have been very cooperative with investigators since then." 2. Police cars pulled up, followed by an unmarked vehicle. A man in a suit stepped out, FBI agent Thompson, as we'd later learn. He'd been building a case against Patricia's network for months, and our situation had finally given him the evidence he needed to move. Patricia's mask completely crumbled. Gone was the fake sweet HOA board member, replaced by something much darker. "You idiots," she snarled. "Do you know how much money you just cost everyone? This was going to be a multi-million-dollar development. Everyone was going to get their cut. Everyone except the homeowners whose properties you destroyed," I pointed out. "How many other barns and historic homes have you demolished, Patricia? How many other neighborhoods have you torn apart?" That's when she made her final mistake. In her anger, she started listing off her successes. Other historic properties she'd managed to get demolished, other homeowners she'd forced out. She was trying to intimidate us, but all she was really doing was confessing to a federal agent who was recording every word. Robert tried to stop her, but it was too late. She was on a roll, revealing details about their operation that even the FBI hadn't known about. Names, dates, properties, payoffs. It all came pouring out in one rage-filled rant. And the whole time, Mrs. Chen's phone and the FBI's equipment were capturing every word. As the FBI agents led Patricia and Robert away in handcuffs, the true scope of their operation started becoming clear. Agent Thompson asked to set up a command center in our community clubhouse, and what they found in the following hours was absolutely mind-blowing. First, they executed a search warrant on Patricia and Robert's house. Remember how Tom had footage of them shredding documents? Well, they weren't as thorough as they thought. In their panic, they'd only managed to shred the most recent papers. The agents found boxes of documents in their attic, records going back years, detailing every scam they'd ever pulled. You wouldn't believe how organized they were, Agent Thompson told us later. They had entire playbooks for taking over HOAs, step-by-step guides for forging documents, lists of corrupt officials they could bribe. They even had psychological profiles of the types of homeowners who were most likely to give up and sell when pressured. But the real goldmine was Patricia's laptop. Despite her attempts to delete everything, the FBI's tech team recovered thousands of emails and documents. They found spreadsheets tracking their various schemes across multiple states, complete with profit projections and timelines. My barn wasn't just another target, it was part of what they called Project Heritage Conversion. Mrs. Chen, who'd become something of a neighborhood investigator herself, was going through old photos she'd taken when she made another discovery. In pictures from various neighborhood events, she spotted Patricia in the background, months before she officially moved in. She'd been surveilling our neighborhood, studying our routines, identifying potential targets. "Look at this," Mrs. Chen said, showing us a photo from last year's 4th of July picnic. In it, Patricia was talking to someone we recognized, a local real estate agent who'd been pressuring historic property owners to sell. They'd been planning this for over a year. The FBI also found something disturbing in their garage, a makeshift office filled with surveillance equipment. They'd been monitoring multiple properties, tracking when people left for work, noting patterns in our daily routines. They even had detailed notes about my daughter's wedding plans, which they'd gathered from hacking into my email. Tom, being on the HOA board, had access to our neighborhood's financial records. With the FBI's guidance, he started going through them line by line. What he found was shocking. Patricia had been embezzling HOA funds through fake maintenance contracts, channeling money into shell companies they controlled. Every time she filed a complaint about someone's property, she'd then arrange for one of her fake companies to handle the repairs, Tom explained. She wasn't just forcing people out, she was profiting from harassing them along the way. The demolition crew supervisor, now fully cooperating with authorities, provided even more evidence. He showed them text messages where Patricia had instructed them to accidentally damage certain parts of my barn during the demolition, specifically the areas where my classic cars were stored. They wanted to make it look like the cars had been destroyed in the collapse, when in reality they'd already arranged to sell them through yet another fake company. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery came from Sarah's investigation into their previous schemes. She found a pattern. They didn't just target any historic properties. They specifically went after homes owned by people who were likely to be away for extended periods, people with kids getting married, people with upcoming surgeries, people caring for sick relatives in other states. They had a whole system, Sarah explained, showing us their documents. They'd monitor obituaries, social media, local news, anything that might indicate when someone would be vulnerable. Then they'd move in, establish themselves in the neighborhood, and wait for the perfect opportunity. The FBI brought in additional agents as the case expanded. They set up a hotline for other potential victims, and within days, calls started pouring in from all over the country. Other homeowners, other neighborhoods, other HOAs, all with stories eerily similar to mine. But just when we thought we'd uncovered everything, one of the FBI's forensic accountants made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden in Patricia's financial records was evidence of something much bigger than just property fraud. Something that would turn this, from a local crime story, into a federal investigation involving multiple agencies. The FBI's forensic accountant discovered that Patricia and Robert weren't just running a property fraud scheme. They were part of a massive money laundering operation. Those fake companies they'd created for demolition and repairs, they were actually funneling money for a huge criminal enterprise that spanned multiple countries. Your barn wasn't just demolished for a development project, Agent Thompson explained to me. It was part of a complex scheme to clean dirty money through real estate transactions. Every time they destroyed a historic property and built new developments, they were washing millions in illegal funds. The numbers were staggering. The FBI found transactions linking Patricia and Robert to over $50 million in laundered money over the past 5 years. They'd been working with corrupt real estate developers, crooked politicians, and even organized crime figures. My peaceful, historic neighborhood had somehow become a pawn in an international criminal conspiracy. But here's where it gets really interesting. Remember those investors Patricia tried to call for help? Turns out some of them were already under surveillance by other federal agencies. When Patricia started frantically reaching out to them, she inadvertently helped the feds connect some major dots in their ongoing investigations. Sarah, who'd been digging through the legal paperwork, found something fascinating in the development company's structure. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a complex diagram of shell companies. Every time they demolished a historic property, they'd create a new LLC for the development project. But if you trace the money, it all leads back to accounts in countries known for banking secrecy. The demolition worker who'd turned on them provided another crucial piece of the puzzle. He showed the FBI text messages where Patricia had instructed him to inflate the demolition costs by 10 times the actual amount. The extra money wasn't just profit, it was being used to legitimize illegal funds coming in from their criminal partners. They picked historic properties for a reason, Agent Thompson explained. The unique nature of these buildings made it easier to justify inflated costs. Who's going to question spending millions to carefully demolish a historic structure and build luxury housing? It was the perfect cover. Mrs. Chen, still playing detective, had been going through her photos of Patricia's visitors over the past year. She documented every strange car, every unusual meeting. The FBI was amazed by her attention to detail. Her photos helped them identify several high-level members of the criminal organization who'd visited under the guise of being potential developers. But the biggest bombshell came when the FBI searched Patricia and Robert's storage unit, not the one where they'd hidden my cars, but another one registered under one of their aliases. Inside, they found dozens of fake identities, prepaid phones, and most importantly, a laptop containing encrypted communications with their criminal contacts. The FBI's tech team cracked the encryption and found years of messages detailing their operation. Patricia and Robert had been recruited by the criminal organization specifically because of their experience in real estate fraud. They were one of several teams operating across the country, all using the same playbook to launder money through property development. Tom, who'd been helping analyze the HOA financial records, made another crucial discovery. They weren't just using the demolition costs to launder money, he explained. Every HOA fee, every fine they issued, every maintenance contract, it was all part of the scheme. They were using our HOA's legitimate banking relationships to clean smaller amounts of money regularly. The investigation expanded rapidly. The FBI brought in agents from their organized crime unit, financial crimes specialists, and even international law enforcement liaisons. What had started as an investigation into a demolished barn was now exposing a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had operated undetected for years. Patricia and Robert's arrest triggered a domino effect. Their criminal associates, realizing the scheme was exposed, started turning on each other. Some tried to flee the country. Others reached out to prosecutors, hoping to make deals. The organization was imploding, and it all started because Patricia got too greedy with my barn. But even as the larger investigation unfolded, we had more immediate concerns. My classic cars were still missing, presumed to be hidden in one of their many storage facilities. The barn was still a pile of rubble, and we were about to discover that Patricia had one more surprise waiting for us, something she'd set in motion before her arrest that would test our community in ways we never expected. Just when we thought we had a handle on everything, Patricia's final trap was sprung. 2 days after her arrest, every homeowner in our neighborhood received certified letters from something called Heritage Preservation Holdings, LLC. The letters claimed that our entire neighborhood had been sold to this company months ago, and we were all technically trespassing on their property. At first, we thought it was just another one of Patricia's fake companies and forged documents. But Sarah's preliminary investigation revealed something troubling. The company appeared to be legitimate, and they had paperwork that seemed to show they'd purchased the entire development from the original builders, including all the individual lots. "This is incredibly sophisticated," Sarah explained as we gathered in the community center. "They found a loophole in the original development agreement from 15 years ago. There was a clause about bulk property transfers that was never properly closed when the individual lots were sold to homeowners. The FBI was just as surprised as we were. Agent Thompson brought in their real estate fraud specialists, who discovered that Patricia and Robert had been setting this up for over a year before they even moved in. They'd created a complex web of property transfers that made it nearly impossible to determine who actually owned what. Think of it like a shell game, Agent Thompson said, trying to explain the complexity. They moved the property rights through so many different companies and jurisdictions that even our best forensic accountants are having trouble tracking it all. But here's where it got really interesting. Mrs. Chen, still our neighborhood's unofficial detective, noticed something about the timing. The company had been registered exactly 1 day after she'd caught Patricia taking those late-night photos of my barn. This wasn't just another scam. It was their backup plan in case their original scheme fell apart. Tom called an emergency HOA meeting, but that only made things more complicated. Turns out Patricia had inserted language into our HOA bylaws months ago that gave the board special powers in case of an ownership dispute. Of course, she'd done this during one of those fake emergency meetings she'd created documentation for. She's trying to force a mass buyout, Sarah realized as she dug deeper into the documents. If they can create enough legal uncertainty about the property ownership, they can pressure people to sell for pennies on the dollar just to avoid years of litigation. The stress was starting to show in our community. Some neighbors were talking about just selling and moving away. Others wanted to fight. We were exactly where Patricia had wanted us, divided and uncertain. Even from jail, she was still causing chaos. But then something unexpected happened. Remember that retired real estate lawyer who was one of their angry investors? When he heard about this new scheme, he reached out to Sarah. He'd seen similar scams before and knew exactly how to fight them. The key, he explained over a conference call, is to follow the money backward. Every property transfer requires payment records. If we can prove the payments were fraudulent or never actually happened, the whole house of cards falls apart. This kicked off a massive community effort. Everyone started digging through their old closing documents from when they'd bought their homes. Mrs. Chen organized all the paperwork chronologically, creating a timeline of every property transfer in the neighborhood's history. Meanwhile, the FBI's investigation had led them to a small law firm in Delaware that had handled most of Heritage Preservation Holdings' paperwork. When agents raided the firm's offices, they found something crucial: evidence that all the property transfers had been backdated. They created the documentation after the fact, Agent Thompson explained. They were counting on no one looking too closely at the dates and notary stamps. But when you line everything up chronologically, there are dozens of impossibilities. For example, one document claimed to transfer property rights on a day when the notary who supposedly witnessed it was actually in the hospital. Another showed signatures from a corporate officer who hadn't even been hired by that company yet. Patricia had gotten sloppy in her rush to set up this backup plan. But just when we thought we were making progress, another bombshell dropped. One of Patricia's associates, facing serious jail time, decided to cooperate with the FBI. What he revealed about their operation, and specifically about their plans, for our neighborhood was more disturbing than anything we'd imagined. The cooperating associate was a guy named Michael Stevens, who'd worked as Patricia and Robert's IT specialist. He was the one who'd helped them set up all their fake companies' websites, create legitimate-looking documents, and handle their encrypted communications. When he realized he was facing serious federal charges, he decided to tell the FBI everything. "You don't understand," he told Agent Thompson during his interview, which we later got to watch. "Your neighborhood wasn't just another target. It was meant to be their masterpiece, their proof of concept. If they could pull this off, they were planning to replicate it in historic neighborhoods across the country." According to Stevens, my barn's demolition was just phase one. They had plans drawn up for every historic property in our neighborhood. They weren't just going to build luxury townhouses. They were planning to essentially erase every trace of the area's history and replace it with what they called a premium modern community. But here's where it got really disturbing. Stevens revealed that Patricia and Robert had developed what they called their pressure protocol, a systematic way to force people out of historic properties. They'd start with minor harassment through HOA violations, then escalate to property damage, and finally use legal pressure through their fake property claims. They had this whole psychological profile worked out, Stevens explained. They knew exactly how much pressure to apply, when to back off, when to push harder. They'd studied which tactics worked best on different types of homeowners. They treated it like a science. The FBI found presentations on Patricia's encrypted laptop outlining their entire methodology. They'd categorized homeowners into different types: quick sellers, who'd give up at the first sign of trouble; fighters, who'd resist until legal threats appeared; and heritage holders like me, who were emotionally attached to their historic properties. For each category, they had a specific approach. Quick sellers would get bombarded with violation notices and fines until they felt overwhelmed. Fighters would face escalating legal pressure and mysterious property damage. But heritage holders, they saved their most aggressive tactics for us. The barn demolition wasn't just about your property, Stevens revealed. It was meant to send a message to everyone else in the neighborhood. They wanted to show that no property was safe, no matter how historic or well-protected it seemed to be. Mrs. Chen, who'd been taking notes throughout all this, made a crucial connection. She pulled up her photos from the past year and started matching dates with Stevens' timeline. Every accident in our neighborhood, from mysterious property damage to strange maintenance issues, corresponded with their pressure protocol schedule. But Stevens had more to reveal. He showed the FBI where to find Patricia and Robert's cloud storage accounts, which contained years of documentation about their operations. Among these files was something that made my blood run cold. Detailed plans for what they would have done to our neighborhood if their scheme had succeeded. The plans showed a completely transformed landscape. Every historic home would be demolished, every tree cut down, every piece of heritage erased. In its place would be a sterile, modern development with prices so high that none of the current residents could afford to stay, even if they wanted. But here's the really clever part, Stevens explained. They weren't just planning to profit from the development, they had a whole second phase worked out. Once they'd erased all the historic properties, they were going to market the neighborhood's lost heritage as a selling point. They'd create fake historical markers, build replica structures, and sell the whole thing as a tribute to the past. Tom, who'd been analyzing their financial projections, was stunned by the numbers. They weren't just looking to make millions, he said. This was a billion-dollar project when you factor in all the properties they planned to acquire and develop. Stevens also revealed something that explained why Patricia had seemed so confident even after her arrest. They had a contingency plan that went way beyond that heritage preservation holding scheme, something that would cause chaos in historic neighborhoods across the country if it ever came to light. The contingency plan Stevens revealed was like something out of a thriller movie. Patricia and Robert hadn't just been documenting their own schemes. They'd been collecting dirt on corrupt officials, crooked developers, and compromised historical preservation boards across the country. They had evidence of bribes, falsified documents, and illegal demolitions going back decades. It was their insurance policy, Stevens explained. If they ever got caught, they planned to release all this information at once. The chaos would make it impossible for authorities to focus just on their case. Plus, they figured some of these powerful people would step in to help them to keep their own secrets hidden. The FBI found an encrypted file on Patricia's cloud drive labeled Operation Preservation, their name for this dead man's switch. It contained thousands of documents, emails, and recordings that could implicate hundreds of people in similar schemes across the country. Some of the names in those files went all the way up to state government level. The really clever part, Agent Thompson said during our briefing, was how they gathered this information. Every time they worked with someone corrupt, they secretly documented everything. They turned their own criminal activities into an evidence-gathering operation. Sarah, who'd been reviewing the legal implications, was stunned by the scope. They have evidence of historical property fraud in over 200 communities across 12 states. Some of these cases go back 15 years. If this information got out all at once, it would overwhelm the entire legal system. But Patricia hadn't just collected this information, she'd organized it for maximum impact. The files were set up to be automatically released to news outlets, law enforcement agencies, and social media if certain conditions were met. It was her way of ensuring she had leverage even if she got caught. Mrs. Chen made another crucial discovery while going through her photos. She'd captured pictures of Patricia meeting with various officials who appeared in the files. "Look at this," she said, pulling up a photo from a community event. She wasn't just collecting evidence, she was actively meeting with these people, probably threatening to expose them if they didn't cooperate. The FBI had to move carefully. They couldn't risk the information getting out all at once, but they also couldn't ignore the crimes documented in Patricia's files. They set up a special task force just to handle the fallout from what they found. In Operation Preservation, we're having to work backwards, Agent Thompson explained. We need to verify each piece of evidence, identify all the players involved, and plan coordinated arrests across multiple jurisdictions. One wrong move, and Patricia's dead man's switch could throw historic preservation laws into chaos nationwide. Stevens helped the FBI understand how the automatic release system worked. Patricia had set it up so that if she didn't enter a code every 48 hours, or if certain keywords appeared in news articles about her arrest, everything would be automatically released. She thought it made her untouchable, Stevens said. She figured no one would dare prosecute her too aggressively if she had all this hanging over their heads. But she didn't count on me knowing how to disable the system. Working with the FBI's cyber team, Stevens was able to prevent the automatic release while preserving all the evidence. This meant the FBI could now use Patricia's own insurance policy against her and her network of corrupt officials. Tom, who'd been helping coordinate with other HOA boards dealing with similar issues, realized something important. They weren't just targeting random historic neighborhoods, he said. They were specifically going after communities where they already had dirt on local officials. They were using their blackmail material to smooth the way for their schemes. But even with the dead man's switch neutralized, we weren't out of the woods yet. Patricia still had supporters in powerful positions, people who had too much to lose if everything came to light. And some of them were already making moves to try to discredit our case and protect themselves. The pushback started subtly at first. Local news stations suddenly seemed uninterested in covering our story. The county clerk's office misplaced some of our important property records. Building inspectors who had previously verified my barn's good condition suddenly couldn't locate their reports. They're trying to erase the paper trail, Sarah explained during an emergency meeting at her office. Someone's pulling strings to make evidence disappear before we can use it in court. But they didn't count on Mrs. Chen's meticulous documentation. She'd photographed every single piece of paper related to the neighborhood over the past year. When the county clerk claimed they had no record of my property inspection from 3 months ago, Mrs. Chen pulled up photos of the original documents, complete with date stamps and official seals. Then things got more aggressive. Tom started getting anonymous calls suggesting he should reconsider his involvement in the case. The Historical Preservation Society that had helped with my barn's restoration suddenly faced a surprise audit. Even Agent Thompson admitted that there was pressure from above to prioritize other cases. "This goes higher than we thought," Agent Thompson told us privately. "We're seeing interference from people who shouldn't even know about this investigation. Yet, someone's trying very hard to make this go away." But their pressure tactics had the opposite effect. The more they tried to suppress the story, the more interested legitimate journalists became. When reporter Jessica Martinez from the state newspaper started digging into why local media was suddenly silent about such a juicy story. "I've been a journalist for 20 years, Jessica told us during an interview. "When everyone suddenly decides not to cover a story like this, it usually means someone powerful is scared. And that makes me very interested." Her investigation uncovered connections we hadn't even known about. The development company that Patricia and Robert worked with had ties to a state senator. The judge who'd signed some of their fraudulent court orders was golfing buddies with one of the biggest real estate developers in the region. The web of corruption went deeper than anyone imagined. Stevens, still cooperating from protective custody, provided another crucial piece of information. Patricia hadn't just been collecting dirt on officials. She'd been recording every conversation she had with them. She kept these recordings in a separate, secure location as extra insurance. She called it her retirement fund, Stevens explained. She figured if everything else failed, she could always use these recordings to negotiate her way out of trouble. The FBI tech team found these recordings hidden in cloud storage accounts registered under various aliases. The contents were explosive. Hours of conversations with corrupt officials, detailed discussions of illegal schemes, explicit mentions of bribes and payoffs. But the most damaging recording was a conversation between Patricia and a high-ranking state official. They were discussing not just our neighborhood, but dozens of historic communities across the state. The official was helping coordinate similar schemes in multiple locations, taking a percentage of each successful property grab. Mrs. Chen, who never seemed to sleep these days, made another crucial discovery. She'd been monitoring real estate, listings in other historic neighborhoods, and found a pattern. The same development companies that had worked with Patricia were using similar tactics in other communities. "Look at this," she said, spreading out a map covered in red dots. Every red dot is a historic property that was mysteriously demolished in the past 3 years. When you connect the dots, you can literally trace Patricia's network across the state. The pressure to drop the case kept mounting. Sarah's law firm started losing major clients. Tom's business suddenly faced multiple surprise inspections. My insurance company abruptly cancelled my policy, citing increased risk factors. But what these powerful people didn't understand was that their pressure was only making us more determined. Every attempt to silence us just proved how important our case was. And we had one advantage they didn't know about, something we'd discovered in Patricia's files that would turn their own tactics against them. Remember those classic cars that disappeared when Patricia had my barn demolished? Well, it turns out their disappearance was actually the key to bringing down the entire corrupt network. While going through Patricia's files, Stevens found something fascinating: detailed documentation about a classic car laundering scheme that connected everything together. They weren't just stealing cars, Stevens explained during a meeting with the FBI. They were using them to move money between their fake companies. Each car would be sold multiple times at inflated prices, creating a paper trail of legitimate-looking transactions. Your cars were supposed to be their biggest score yet. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit was particularly interested in this revelation. They traced my cars through a series of fake auctions and phantom buyers, each transaction getting more expensive. But here's the brilliant part. Mrs. Chen's obsessive photography had accidentally captured evidence of where the cars really were. "Look at this," she said, zooming in on a photo she'd taken while following one of Patricia's associates. In the background of what seemed like a random street shot was a familiar car trailer entering a private storage facility. The FBI raided the place and found not just my cars, but dozens of other vehicles stolen in similar schemes. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Remember that development company executive, Mr. Harrison, who turned on Patricia earlier? He'd been doing some digging of his own, trying to protect himself. He discovered that Patricia had been keeping a second set of books, one for the legitimate business, and one showing the real flow of money and stolen property. "She documented everything," Mr. Harrison told Agent Thompson. "Every bribe, every fraudulent transaction, every corrupt official on the payroll. She was obsessed with having leverage over everyone involved. But she made one crucial mistake. She stored it all in a place we could access. That place turned out to be a series of safety deposit boxes registered to one of her shell companies. Inside, they found something even more valuable than evidence. They found Patricia's personal notebooks. For years, she'd been keeping detailed journals of her operations, including names, dates, and amounts of every corrupt deal she'd made. "It's like finding a roadmap to organized crime in the real estate world," Sarah said, as she reviewed the contents. "She has everything documented: which judges could be bribed, which officials would look the other way, which banks would help launder the money. She even kept track of how much she was paying each person." The journals revealed something else too. Patricia had been planning to double-cross her powerful allies. She'd been gathering evidence against them, not just for protection, but because she planned to eventually blackmail them for even more money. She had calculated exactly how much she could extort from each person based on what she knew about them. Tom, who'd been analyzing the financial records, made another crucial discovery. "Look at these patterns," he said, pointing to a spreadsheet. Every time they demolished a historic property, there was a matching transaction in an offshore account. They weren't just stealing properties. They were getting paid bounties for destroying historic buildings. This revelation led the FBI to uncover a larger conspiracy. Certain development companies were specifically targeting historic neighborhoods, using people like Patricia to do their dirty work. The goal wasn't just profit. They were systematically erasing historic properties to drive up land values and force out long-time residents. Jessica Martinez, our journalist ally, started connecting the dots between different cases across the state. She found similar patterns everywhere: historic properties mysteriously condemned, sudden demolitions, corrupt officials looking the other way. It was all part of a coordinated effort to reshape entire communities for profit. But the most damning evidence came from Patricia's own security cameras. She'd been so paranoid about keeping evidence on everyone else that she'd recorded all her own meetings too. The FBI found footage of her meeting with high-ranking officials, explicitly discussing their corrupt deals and plans for other historic neighborhoods. She literally recorded herself committing crimes, Agent Thompson said, shaking his head. And not just herself, she got dozens of other people on video admitting to their roles in the scheme. It's like she was building her own prosecution case without realizing it. The day of Patricia and Robert's trial was like something out of a movie. The courthouse was packed with people from various historic neighborhoods they'd targeted. Mrs. Chen had organized a whole network of residents who'd been victims of similar schemes, and they all showed up to witness justice being served. The prosecution's case was absolutely airtight. Sarah had worked with the FBI to organize the evidence in a way that showed the full scope of their operation. They started with my barn demolition, and then systematically revealed how it connected to their larger criminal enterprise. Your Honor, the prosecutor began, what began as an investigation into a single demolished barn has uncovered one of the largest organized property fraud schemes in state history. The defendants didn't just destroy historic buildings, they attacked the very fabric of communities for profit. Patricia and Robert's defense strategy fell apart almost immediately. They tried claiming they were just overzealous property developers who might have bent some rules but meant no real harm. Then the prosecution started playing their own recorded conversations. The look on Patricia's face when they played the video of her bragging about how easy it was to forge court orders. Priceless, Tom whispered to me during the trial. She didn't know about Mrs. Chen's zoom lens catching her little celebration. A party after my barn came down, but the real bombshell came when some of their former associates started testifying. The demolition company owner, facing his own charges, decided to tell everything. He described in detail how Patricia and Robert had orchestrated dozens of emergency demolitions across multiple states, always using the same playbook we'd experienced. They had it down to a science, he testified. They'd identify historic properties, infiltrate the HOA, create fake safety concerns, and then strike when the owners were away. They even had a name for it, Operation Clean Slate. They saw historic preservation laws as obstacles to be overcome, not protections to be respected. The evidence about the classic car scheme proved especially damaging. The FBI had traced every car they'd stolen, showing how they used them to launder money through fake auctions and phantom buyers. My cars had been just the latest in a long string of similar thefts. Each stolen vehicle was like a blank check, the financial crimes expert testified. They'd sell it multiple times through their network of shell companies, inflating the price each time. It was a way to make their illegal profits look legitimate. Patricia's face got paler and paler as the evidence mounted. Her high-priced defense team looked increasingly uncomfortable as Sarah and the prosecution systematically dismantled every attempt at an explanation. Robert started visibly sweating when they showed his forged engineering reports side by side with the real ones. The corruption allegations against local officials added another layer to the trial. Several bureaucrats and politicians were sitting in the gallery, watching their careers implode as Patricia's detailed records of their involvement were presented as evidence. One county commissioner actually tried to flee the courthouse during a lunch break. Jessica Martinez's newspaper coverage of the trial was bringing national attention to the case. She titled her series, "Historic Heist: How Criminals Are Erasing America's Heritage for Profit." Other journalists started picking up the story, investigating similar schemes in their own cities. The jury didn't take long to reach their verdict. Patricia and Robert were found guilty on all counts: fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, destruction of historic property, falsifying official documents, and dozens of other charges. But the judge wasn't finished with them yet. During sentencing, he did something unexpected. He ordered them to listen to impact statements from representatives of every community they'd targeted. For hours, people stood up and described how Patricia and Robert's schemes had affected their neighborhoods, their families, their sense of history and community. Mrs. Chen had organized these testimonies masterfully. She made sure each speaker added something unique to the story, building a powerful narrative about the real cost of their crimes. It wasn't just about property values or historic buildings. It was about the deliberate destruction of community heritage for profit. The judge's sentence exceeded everyone's expectations. Patricia got 15 years in federal prison plus millions in fines and restitution payments. Robert got 12 years, but the judge didn't stop there. He ordered that all their assets, including their hidden accounts and shell companies, be liquidated to create a fund for restoring historic properties they damaged. This court recognizes that the defendants' crimes went beyond simple property damage, the judge declared. They attempted to erase our community's heritage for profit. The punishment must address not just the financial harm, but the cultural damage they've caused. The FBI's investigation led to a domino effect of arrests and indictments. Corrupt officials, crooked developers, fraudulent contractors, dozens of people involved in their scheme faced justice. One by one, Patricia's network of accomplices crumbled as everyone rushed to make deals and avoid lengthy sentences, but the real victory came in the changes that followed. The state legislature, embarrassed by the scandal, passed new laws strengthening historic preservation protections. They created special penalties for crimes involving historic properties and established a task force to investigate similar schemes. My barn? Well, that's actually the best part of this story. Remember that restitution fund the judge created? Our neighborhood was first in line for restoration projects. But instead of just rebuilding my barn, something amazing happened. The whole community got involved in the reconstruction. Tom used his connections in the construction industry to find craftsmen who specialized in historic restoration. Mrs. Chen organized volunteers to help with the smaller tasks. Local history students from the university came to document the rebuilding process for their archives. "This isn't just about replacing what was lost," Sarah told a reporter during the reconstruction. "It's about showing that our community can't be broken by people like Patricia. We're not just rebuilding a barn, we're strengthening our neighborhood." The rebuild actually improved on the original in some ways. We incorporated modern safety features while maintaining the historic appearance. The Historical Society helped us document everything, creating a detailed record for future generations. My workshop space was expanded, and we even added a small museum area to display the barn's history and the story of its destruction and rebirth. My classic cars were all recovered and restored. The FBI found them in various locations across 3 states, each with an interesting story of how Patricia's network had tried to use them for money laundering. They're back in the barn now, but with a much better security system. The whole experience changed our neighborhood for the better. We created a community heritage committee to protect our historic properties. Regular events celebrate our neighborhood's history, drawing visitors from across the state. Jessica Martinez's articles about our case even won a journalism award. Mrs. Jen started a network connecting historic neighborhoods across the country, sharing information about suspicious development practices and preservation strategies. She's become something of a celebrity in historic preservation circles, giving talks about community vigilance and documentation. Tom used his experience to help other HOAs strengthen their bylaws against fraudulent takeovers. He's developed a whole consultation practice helping communities protect themselves from schemes like Patricia's. The FBI even asks him to speak at training sessions about HOA fraud. As for me, well, I've become an advocate for historic preservation myself. I work with Sarah now, helping other communities fight against developers who try to erase history for profit. My barn story has become a case study in how communities can stand together against corporate greed. You know what's really ironic? Patricia's attempt to destroy our neighborhood's history ended up preserving it better than ever. Every historic property in our area is now properly documented, protected, and celebrated. We even created a digital archive of all our historical records, something we might never have done if she hadn't tried to exploit gaps in our documentation. The last I heard, Patricia was trying to appeal her sentence, but given the mountain of evidence against her, it's not looking good. Robert apparently spends his time in prison teaching art classes, a surprisingly positive turn for someone who helped forge so many documents. So that's my story. How an entitled HOA Karen tried to destroy my historic barn and ended up exposing a nationwide criminal enterprise. It's a reminder that sometimes the worst experiences can lead to the best changes, and that no amount of money or power can stand against a community that stands together. Oh, and one final detail. We installed a new weather vane on top of the rebuilt barn. It's a special design featuring a security camera hidden inside. Mrs. Chen's idea, of course, because if there's one thing we've learned, it's that you can never have too much documentation. Up next, you've got two more standout stories, right? On your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.